It's time to set the record queer. The most important member of a covert special operatives team is the sewist. Good morning, unless it's not morning, Setting the Record Queer listeners, and welcome to Setting the Record Queer, a podcast where queer people talk about the pursuits and communities they love. This is episode 3, and it's about sewing. My name is Alexis, my pronouns are it, its, and she, her, and I'm one of your hosts.
I'm Kaylee. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm your other host. And I am in the distant state of California, which is literally as far from our state as we can get without leaving the continental U.S.
I miss you, just so we're clear. She'll be back by the time people listen to this episode, but I miss Kaylee. So, yeah, Kaylee, you're in California, and I just so I can be clear about, like, the level of best girlfriend Kaylee is, Kaylee went all the way to California and bought me a super scope.
That's why I'm here. Totally.
Yeah. Just to buy me a super scope. A super scope is a Super Nintendo Entertainment System, basically light gun accessory, and I want to speedrun games with it for the memes. And Kaylee's the best girlfriend, and got me one.
The best part about this is that it doesn't fit in my luggage home, so I will have to ship it, making me coming here entirely pointless.
So the other exciting thing in recent history, I think, Kaylee, you worked on a little project recently. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, I did. This was actually ready for the last podcast, but we didn't actually have time to talk about it then. So I made a very simple Discord bot that lets you assign pronouns to people in your servers and assign pronouns to yourself and add more pronouns to the list and everything. It's called Pronoun Bot. It's very simple, but it's a useful tool that should be in a lot of servers. So there'll be a link for that in the description if you want it in your own server.
Yeah, PronounBot is really cool. I've been using it in like all of my servers. It does one thing, and it does one thing extremely well, and I have respect for that. Speaking of doing exactly one thing, I did one thing the other day. So this semester in college, I'm taking a class on video game design. That's design, not development, which is pretty nice because I don't really enjoy development. And so this week, we actually played Mario Maker as a way of like talking about game design. So we split the class in two halves, and each half has made a level for the other half, and we're going to play them next week. My main contribution to our half of the class's level was putting a Kaizo block right at the end, because I am a great game designer. So they are going to have a lot of fun with that, I'm sure.
So what is a Kaizo block, for the sake of our listeners?
Yeah, so a Kaizo block is a thing in, like, hard Mario level design. I'm not going to get into the origins of the word Kaizo, but essentially what a Kaizo block is an invisible block placed specifically in the path of where you're most likely to jump, so that you'll bonk on it and fall into a pit. They're really evil.
Seems mean.
Yeah, I never said I was a good game designer.
Unnecessarily so.
Yeah, that's the whole point of them. And that's why I will never be in video game development. Speaking of things that are not video game development, we have an exciting podcast lined up this week. I'm really excited. This guest is someone completely new to Kaylee and I. This isn't like a friend of ours. This isn't really something we're even at all familiar with. So, guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, guys. I am Shannon, otherwise known as Rare Device on the internet. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an art historian and a sewist, a person who sews.
Sewist. I've never actually heard that term. I like it. It's elegant. It is appropriately elegant for sewing. So, Shannon, why don't you give us like a rundown of all of the things you do?
All of the things I do.
All of the things.
For the purposes of this podcast, my main hobby is sewing, really. It's the thing that I spend a lot of my free time doing, a thing that I spend a lot of my free money doing. Not that there's very much of that, because I'm also a grad student. I'm finishing a PhD in contemporary art history at the moment, so I'm writing a dissertation, and that is the thing I spend all the rest of my time doing mostly. I also have a bulldog who I love a lot, and she takes up a lot of my time, and I'm kind of interested in various and sundry fiber artsy pursuits, so things like embroidery and cross stitch. I have a big macrame project going on right now. I dabble.
What's macrame?
Macrame is like rope tying. So think of like 70s plant hangers, but like cool and hip again.
Cool. Sounds like fun. So you do a lot of, as you described, like fiber arts. But like you don't just do those things for fun. So can you give us kind of a rundown of like all the things you do with the things you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my like sewing practice is for myself and for loved ones. I make things for myself and for loved ones, but like on the internet, I'm also really interested in creating community around sewing. So there's a very vibrant sewing community online, on Instagram, on Facebook. But one of the things that I have noticed is that kind of queerness in that community didn't really have a centralized place to go and like chat with each other. So I created a project that is called Sew Queer, SEW, queer, because sewists also love sewing puns. And that's a place where queer sewists can gather and meet each other and create community and conversations.
I love the name. I cannot understate how much I love the name. And it sounds like a really cool project, so I'm really excited to hear more about it.
So, when, how, and why did you start So Queer?
Oh, so I started So Queer at the end of last November. We're coming up on our 1-year anniversary in a couple months. And it was kind of 3 things coming together that made me start it. So one of the things was that I was recognizing sort of a tendency in my own sewing practice to shy away from some of the things that I wanted to sew but thought would be more complicated and also were maybe a little bit scarier because they meant different ways of presenting my gender. And so I was like, let's think about why you're scared of that and write about it, because I'm an academic and I like writing about things in order to process them. So I started doing that and I thought, okay, what if I write about this and then I put it on the internet and I put it on Instagram and I invite people to use this hashtag So Queer that I invented to kind of organize my blog posts about it. And when I kind of started envisioning using this hashtag, I was talking to some other folks who were also thinking about ways of creating queer community in the sewing community. And my friend Katie Whittle, who's Maker and Shaker on Instagram, was like, no, like also start a community so that this is something where there's like a centralized place where people can use the tag, where people can find new friends, new people. And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. I'll also do that. And it was really sort of propelled onward because there had been a couple of different instances in the kind of coming months before then of various sewing companies, indie pattern companies, or sewing challenges on Instagram that had made certain assumptions about who sewists are, particularly that they are cisgender heterosexual women. And I was like, no, we aren't all that. Let's talk about the fact that can be a thing that harms inclusion in the community, but can also be a thing that really makes people feel like they aren't actually welcome in the sewing community. And so I'd like to challenge that a little bit.
That's really cool. That's really cool, actually. I'm very impressed. So you said you've been doing this for almost a year now. So why have you stuck with this? What about it has just like kept you going like this?
I've stuck with it in large part because people are telling me that it means something to them. So we have a lot of uses of the hashtag. We have 1,400 followers right now. There's lots of people who really adopted it very quickly and started using it on every single thing that they made and every single thing that they posted. And it's spread. So we get people who use the hashtag and then are like, I didn't even know there was a community. I just saw someone using the hashtag and it sounded great and I wanted to use it too. But I get messages from people who are like, yeah, I didn't know that other queer people sewed. And that is a thing that I needed to know. And that's a thing that feels important to me. And I think that like the most important part of the project is just affirming people's interest in sewing, but also the fact that it really deeply intersects with like who we are and how we present our identities to the world. And that's not something that's really talked about in the wider sewing world in terms of like queer and trans identities.
Can you elaborate on that a little further, specifically the idea of like sewing and, like queer identities and queer bodies and like what sort of challenges are there in, I guess, like that department?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a lot of conversation happening around the way sewing intersects with identity, because obviously if you're garment sewing, you're making things that go on your body and that people see and that relate to the way you want to present yourself to the world, right? And I think for queer folks, that is a thing that we are all thinking about in a lot of different ways. And so sewing can be something that steps in and helps you develop that when the clothing that the world is presenting to us in ready to wear doesn't fit you, either doesn't fit your body or it doesn't fit the way you identify or the way that you want to present yourself to the world in terms of style or taste or the kinds of garments you like to wear, right? So if you're sewing, you can sew for your body, your own specific particular body, and what it looks like and how it's shaped and what you want to put on it. And so that is a really powerful thing, I think. I think that becomes something that a lot of people kind of grab a hold of and run with.
So I was wondering, I know some very basic sewing to the extent of if something rips, I can fix it. Sort of, sometimes.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Sorry for ruining your swimsuit that one time.
It's okay.
How do you go from there to like actually making full garments? Because from what I see, it's like this seems like an entirely different thing.
Well, if you're mending and you're mending with like a needle and thread, right? You're doing it by hand. You can certainly make a whole garment that way. It might take you a little while, but you can definitely do it. But if you are interested in like really diving into it and being like, yes, I want to make clothes that go on my body and won't fall apart once they're on my body, I think you jump in and you learn how the heck to sew a straight stitch on your machine. And once you have that down, you can do so much. It can be really intimidating to start because I think there's a lot of moving parts, right? There's your pattern, there's how you choose the kind of fabric, there's how the heck your sewing machine even works. And then there's how the heck it all comes together and creates something three-dimensional. But if you start with really basic shapes, you start with really basic patterns, maybe if you're interested in using patterns, or you start with pieces of fabric cut into rectangles that has holes for where your various appendages need to go, and just stitch the places where your appendages don't need to go, that's a garment that you've made, and you can make like a cool oversized t-shirt with with two pieces of fabric that are rectangles.
So you mentioned the idea of a straight stitch. Now, can you please explain this to me as someone who knows literally zero about sewing? Like what is this and what kind of class of thing this is? Get me in on the ground floor of the nitty gritty of how to sew.
Okay, so a straight stitch is sort of just a classic up and down. So if you look at the stitch when you've made it in a garment, it's in a straight line. And on a sewing machine, your stitches are like just little like dashes that go right next to each other and just kind of proceed in a neat orderly line. And this is the most basic stitch that every sewing machine that you would get as kind of a home sewist has. And it's a fairly strong stitch, and it just allows you to bring two or more pieces of fabric together and keep them together for an indefinite period of time, essentially.
Follow-up question. Can we rename it to the queerly forward stitch?
Yes, let's do that.
Great. Fantastic. So I want to get back to talking about So Queer a little bit. You were recommended this podcast by someone in the sewing community, I think. And again, I know nothing about this, so I went to go look at your Instagram feed, and there was a lot there. It was tons of, sharing other people's like posts and garments they made, and, stuff about sewing your pride, another amazing pun that I'm really happy about. So what all does So Queer do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, essentially, So Queer is centralized in an account on Instagram. So it's at SEW Queer. And in the So Queer account, I largely repost pictures that people post using the So Queer hashtag. So it's largely a place to like celebrate the things that sewists in the So Queer community are making, things that they're talking about, and sort of sharing those with the rest of the world so that, you can see it and be like, oh yeah, I love that person. I want to be friends with them. And it can kind of spread community in that way. There's also kind of an element of trying to get people thinking about new things. So the Sew Your Pride challenge was one of those, where in June for Pride Month, I invited people to post using the Sew Your Pride hashtag something that they were particularly proud of or something that related to their pride in some way. And I wanted people to kind of broadly interpret that, and they did. Some folks were like, I made this rainbow outfit to wear to Pride. And other people were like, I made this shirt and I'm really proud of it because it's the first time I've ever been able to feel really comfortable in my gender. So it was really broadly interpreted. And we're going to be doing more things like that going forward, where it's kind of like a challenge to get people thinking about something in particular and to write about it a little bit, not just how I made this, but really what it means to me.
Cool. I like happily dropped a follow on this account after looking at it. It's really cool, and I'm really excited to see all of this stuff that I cannot understand. So why don't we next talk about kind of the sewing community?
Is there a larger sewing community that you interact with, or are the communities kind of isolated and you really only interact with the queer community?
That's actually a really good question. There is definitely a larger sewing community that I do interact with, and was the first place that I landed before I started Sew Queer. Particularly on Instagram, I think because it's such a visual medium, which is really useful if you're sewing and you want to show off things that you've made. There's a really big sewing community of people who post the things that they make, indie pattern companies posting things about their patterns, folks posting tips and tricks and tutorials, all manner of things, whether you're an amateur or a professional. And I continue to interact with that. I've made some like really amazing friends through that. I've learned tons of things because it's a great place to post something to your Instagram and go, I don't hecking know what I'm doing with this. Can somebody help me? Point me to a tutorial. Tell me why this has gone wrong, whatever. And there's always some other sewists there who can be like, oh yeah, I've encountered this before. This is how you fix it. And so that exists on Instagram, also in like Facebook groups, also in various websites that are particularly dedicated to sewing. So there's a number of different websites that have like community discussion boards, that have pattern reviews, things like that, that are also dedicated to building up sewing community. It's a hobby that has been around for actual millennia. So I don't think it's that surprising that there's a lot of people talking about it and doing it across the various facets of the internet.
To your knowledge, how queer friendly is the wider sewing community? You've mentioned, problems with assumptions made about, bodies and body types, but in a kind of a wider scope, how queer friendly is the wider sewing community?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that I'm sort of continuing to grapple with, I think, because the sewing community broadly is a pretty welcoming community. It's pretty interested in getting new people involved. We're sort of all really good evangelists for the hobby. So we're like, yes, come and sew. We will show you how. But also because it's a community that particularly in its Instagram form, so particularly kind of the community on Instagram, tends to be cisgender, heterosexual white women, often in kind of their 30s-ish, which I fall into a number of those categories, but not all of them. There tend to be just assumptions that come along with that, and sort of the cultural assumptions that we are all taught to carry, which means that there's folks who are talking about making particularly for women's bodies and not necessarily recognizing people who are non-binary or people who don't identify as women who are sewing for themselves or for others. There's a lot of talk about making menswear for your man, which many of us are not doing and will never do. And there can be a lot of like binary talk in that way. And I think that that's a thing that is in most places not deliberately malicious. It's not about sexual harassment or about necessarily gatekeeping so much as it is around ingrained assumptions that people either haven't challenged in themselves or aren't willing to challenge in themselves. And so that's something that I'm kind of pushing back on a little bit.
It's really cool how you're this whole project is kind of taking part in pushing back against a community's norms and assumptions. That's really commendable. That's awesome. So my other question about the sewing community is, how can people get into it? Where is the point of entry?
Ooh, that's a great question. What I did was I joined Instagram and I started looking at hashtags. So there's a number of different common sewing hashtags that you can kind of dive into, and Instagram really wants you to dive into those. So it will like start to suggest other things to you. And so I started looking at like the hashtag sewing, and that got me into a number of different places. If you're a person who doesn't use Instagram, you can look on things like Facebook communities. You can go to websites like patternreview.com or textilia.com that are Also kind of community websites. There's quite a few of them out there, in fact. But my suggestion would be once you start making friends in it on whatever platform you use, that kind of cascades and you start making more and more and more and more individual sewing friends.
Cool. And yeah, so that's, I think, a pretty good point of entry for like the sewing community. How would someone go about getting into sewing itself?
This is a good question, but also in some ways a deceptively complicated question. And what I mean by that is it depends on how you like to learn. So for myself, I like knew the basics of sewing. My mom taught me a lot of the basics of sewing when I was little, but I had never really taken on a garment that I like really wanted to make look good until my first year of grad school. So like 5 years ago. And I am a person who basically just experiments with things until they work or don't work. And so that's what I started doing is I started cutting out fabric and sewing it together in ways I knew would work. And when something went wrong, I tried to fix it. And I started sort of, either Googling solutions or just experimenting with solutions. And that basically got me into the basics of sewing where I was doing it by trial and error. But if you're not a person who's comfortable with trial and error, which plenty of people aren't, and I think that's also okay, trying to find a good place where there's a type of instruction that works for you is going to be really useful. So this might mean finding a friend who knows how to sew and going, hey, can we sit down with your sewing machine and you can just show me the basics of how it works, and then I can experiment on my own. That might be a thing. Taking a sewing class at your local fabric store might be a thing. So if you have a local fabric store, even big chains like Joann's will have sewing classes that are based for, that are directed at kind of the introductory sewist who doesn't know what they're doing at all. And you can go in and you'll learn how to thread your machine, how to use the machine, how to cut out fabric, how to put it together. You'll usually make something simple like pajama pants or a tote bag or a pillowcase or something like that. So those are good places to look. Or again, if you're a person who just wants to kind of do it by yourself or you're low on funds or what have you, there are like a ton of YouTube tutorials. So Google how to start sewing on YouTube, I think, and you'll find tons of videos if that's a more comfortable way of learning for you.
Cool. I might actually look into some of this stuff. This sounds fun.
So in terms of the community, are there any community events that are happening right now or coming up? Or are there events in this community?
That's a good question. There are. And because it's sort of the part of the community that I'm a part of is sort of diffuse across the internet, they tend to be like internet events. And right now, for instance, there is a month-long photo challenge happening that is really popular on Instagram that is called the Sew Photo Hop. And this is for each day for a month, you post a picture that is related to a particular prompt. So it might be like your favorite make, or there was one day that was like your ugliest make. What were you thinking with this? It might be something like a tip or a trick that you want to share with the community. And you just post one picture a day that relates to that prompt. And this was basically one of my favorite ways to make friends when I first started in the sewing community is I followed that tag and I started following people whose work looked really interesting to me. And I made a ton of friends. This would have been like 3 years ago when the Sew Photo Hop was going on. And I've participated in it every September since then. There are also, like, depending on where you are, there might be in-person events. So there's a really popular event called Frock Tales, which is like cocktails but wearing a frock.
What is a frock?
Like a dress. It's like a British term for like a slightly fancy dress. And so I think Frock Tales started probably in the UK, but a number of different cities will host a Frock Tales where the whole point of it is you make a slightly fancy outfit and you go and you have some food with other sewists who are local to your city. So that might be a thing that, depending on where various people who are listening to this are, there might be a Frock Tales in your town.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Okay, so I have one more question before we move on to the next segment of this podcast. What would you say in your life, in your like speaking and writing, is your ratio of using the word sew, S-O, versus sew, S-E-W?
I use both of them so much. am a person who uses so as a connector between words, which you might notice. And every time I do it, I think you're using this word too much. But also, there's like a point of pride if you're a sewist when your phone stops correcting SEW so to C. And I recently got a new phone and it took it like a long time to stop doing that. And it was really annoying because you're always talking about like, I'm seeing this thing right now. And you're like, no, I'm sewing this thing right now. I'm not seeing it. So
So would you say that the word sew, S-O, allows you to sew S-E-W sentences together?
oh, so clever. Yes. Hashtag so clever. I'm not kidding when I say we love those puns. The number of like sewing stores that are like sew something in their name is astronomical.
See, I feel like I would get along great in this community because I love terrible puns. All right, let's move on to the next part of this podcast. The next segment is called the Performance Showcase. With every guest we have them, present a sample of their work in whatever form that may take for a podcast and for their medium of work or activity. And then we talk about it. So for you, Shannon, you have given us a shirt that you made, like from more or less from scratch. And you said you've got kind of a story here. So first, just like to give a general rundown of what's going on here. And we will post a link to this blog post all about this shirt in the show notes so you can see the pictures and read all the description yourself. But it is a dress shirt that seems really well fitted to your body, which I'm really impressed by, with a really pretty and unique pattern that I don't know how to describe. It's like made of like flowers and stuff. And it's real nice. Shannon, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened here?
Yeah, so this started largely from the fabric. So the fabric is a particular historical print. So it's by a British designer named William Morris, who was designing in the late 19th century. And he made a number of these kind of repeating prints that were printed on fabric and on wallpaper and on all sorts of things. So this one is called the Strawberry Thieves, and it's because these are like little birds who are like eating strawberries in the print. And so I've really been interested in his work for a long time, and I wanted to get some of my hands on some of this fabric. I managed to order some online, and I was like, I need to make something special out of this because it's like really nice fabric, and it's a print that I really love. I love the colors of it. So I want to take my time with this, essentially. And at this point, this was about a year ago, a little less than a year ago that I was working on this. I hadn't yet made for myself a full shirt like that, like a full button front shirt with a collar and a collar stand and cuffs, all of the doodads. I had made various outfits that incorporated some of those details, but not like an actual shirt. So I was like, okay, we're going to do this and I'm going to take the time to make it fit well. And I took a pattern that is marketed as a menswear pattern and started to open it up and look at the pattern pieces and see what I needed to do to fit it to my body, which turned out to be like a lot. And it was a lot of work, but it was really rewarding because it was one of those things where I took the pattern, I made the adjustments I knew I would have to make first. So for instance, menswear, I'm using kind of like air quotes here, is not intended to accommodate breasts. And I have breasts. So I needed something that would, so that I don't get the like all too familiar buttons yanking across my chest look, which is not a great thing.
Yeah. So, in this blog post, you mention, just looking at a quote here, that you like the clean lines of Simplicity 8427, which is the sewing pattern you're describing. And you say that your goal was to maintain a flat front with one side bust dart. What do those things mean?
So a dart is a technique that you use to take a flat piece of fabric and give it three-dimensionality. And so it's basically just a wedge of fabric, like a triangular shaped wedge of fabric, that you stitch the two long ends of the triangle together, and it makes like a little like concave shape in the fabric. Does that make sense the way I'm describing it?
Yeah, I think so.
And so this is like if you look at a shirt or like a blouse or a dress that's intended to be fitted to the body, it will have darts on either side of the bust. So sort of pointing on either side of the bust, pointing towards the boobs. And that is something that is not included on menswear clothing because they don't need a lot of shaping in the chest if you don't have breasts. And so I had to do what's called a full bust adjustment in order to slash my pattern open and add those darts in order to give it more room and give it that shaping that I wanted so that it wouldn't be like super baggy through my arms and shoulders.
Cool. Learn new things every day. You mentioned, like I said, that you like the clean lines of the Simplicity 8427 pattern. Can you talk us through kind of what was going through your head when you picked this pattern out, and you like the clean lines? Let's hear about that. Can you like walk us through what was going on in your head?
Absolutely. So shirtwear design has a lot of different details that you can include, from what the collar looks like, how big it is, how pointy it is, like what the shape is like, to how the front overlap is designed. And so if you take a look at like a number of different shirts, like things that are intended to be like a little bit dressier tend to have a plainer front where your front is just folded over, rather than including what is called a button placket, which is or a button band, which is like the bands that goes down the front. And so I liked that this was just folded over, because it gives the front of it sort of this almost seamless appearance where I can take my pattern and I can match it up, and you can't actually really tell where the front seam is. And that's a little bit harder to do if you're adding in a button band down the front, which is like a separate piece of fabric that you add to the front. So I liked that. It has like a really nice sort of short collar, like a narrow collar that is a little bit more modern looking, and also I think suits my kind of like neck height better. I don't know, a big collar sometimes feels too big on me. And it just has like really basic cuffs, and they're not fancy. They don't have like extra details. They're just like nice and simple, which I liked.
Cool. That was a lot more than I was expecting out of, one sense of I like the clean lines. It's really, really impressive, like how much goes into like, because at least when I think of sewing, I think of like sitting down with a piece of fabric and a machine. I don't really tend to think of like picking out a pattern and like adjusting measurements, and like how picking out a pattern in and of itself is like this whole ordeal. That's really interesting. So one question I do have, you mentioned kind of the idea of like taking this, quote unquote, menswear pattern and adapting it to yourself and your body as not a man. Was there, in addition to the practicalities of this, was there like an emotional grapple there?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was talking a little bit about like why I started So Queer, one of the reasons that I started it was to make myself also think about and write about the kinds of garments that I was drawn to making. And one of the things that is a little bit of a challenge in the kind of like, quote, again, menswear that I like to wear in terms of like shirts and blazers, things like that, is that they do take a little bit more technical skill than like a dress. A dress is not actually that hard to make, but making a blazer is harder to make because there's a lot of structure to it. There's a lot of pieces. You're often working with like a thicker fabric. And so I think the level of skill just kind of levels you up a little bit. I haven't made a blazer yet. And same with shirt making, is it has a lot of like fiddly little details on it, which are not hard necessarily, but require some patience. So there was a part of me that was like, oh, I'm not making those because they're kind of hard. And I'm not quite ready to tackle that yet. And then as I thought about that more, I was also like, maybe you're also not making that because it's a little bit scary to affirm that this is the kind of thing that you want to wear sometimes, when I also like to wear dresses a lot. Sometimes like there's this sense that the fact that I want my style and my wardrobe to be really broad and expansive and to encompass a lot of different articles of clothing that have different gendered connotations feels really good, but it can also feel really scary because it can feel like I'm getting kind of easily pigeonholed, or certain things feel a little bit riskier to wear, or I'm going to worry that I'm going to make it and it's not going to end up fitting me very well, and I'm just going to feel like extra uncomfortable in it because it doesn't fit me well, and because I'm like, maybe I should be wearing a dress right now instead. So there was a little bit of like internal grappling with that, where I had to tell myself, you shop from the like, quote, menswear section when you buy ready to wear quite frequently. Like that's not an infrequent thing for me, for tops at least. Why aren't you sewing these? Like, why is that not a thing that you are also spending your time creating for yourself? And I had to kind of grapple with that and to go, actually, yeah, this is a thing that I think would be really affirming for me to make. This is a thing that would make me feel good to make. And I'm going to allow myself to do it and to maybe screw up and to maybe feel uncomfortable in it. But maybe I won't. And in this particular shirt, I definitely don't. I feel good in that shirt.
Well, you look good in that shirt. If I do say so myself, the pictures are really pretty. if nothing else, I think that's relatable. If I may go on a tangent here, I actually tried on a like button-down dress shirt for the first time in about 2 years recently, and it was kind of incredible. I had a lot of the same like emotional grappling. The 2 years having been 2 years roughly since I came out in high school, where I went to a uniform high school, where every day up until the day I came out, I was wearing button-down dress shirts and ties. And so this whole 2 year process of like, becoming comfortable in like my body was something that I needed to do. And then also grappling with the fact that I am a woman, that is a fact, but I also very much do like dress shirts and ties. And I think especially grappling with that as a trans woman was difficult, really interesting. There's a thread about it on my Twitter if you want to scroll through like the 30,000 tweets I make a day for a couple days to go find it.
Couple weeks by the time this airs.
Yeah, it'll be a lot of tweets.
Why don't we link it in the show notes?
We'll link it in the show notes. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear about like this whole project and just how much goes into making one shirt. Someone who buys all of its clothes. There's a lot behind the scenes, and I think that's really cool. Kaylee, why don't you get us started on our listener questions for this week?
Sure. If you have any questions for us or for our guest, you can email us at settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com or on our Twitter at STRQueercast. And make sure to listen through the ending of this episode because we will have a new way for you to ask questions as well as another exciting announcement. Anyway, Markita Zakov asks, if you were working as a seamstress /tailor/courtier for a time-traveling, universe-saving crew, which eras would you love/hate to sew for the most?
I love that question, and also I'm like, I never want to do that because that seems like too much pressure. Because what if you get it wrong and then they're killed as witches or something? I think that I don't sew a lot of historical clothing. It's not something that I particularly do, but I love that people do. But if I were to dive into it, so I would really love to do 16th century clothing. So if we're thinking like sort of Tudor, Henry VIII, think of like big doublets and like giant skirts with big hips and like really cool corsetry that makes you look like a cone. I think that stuff is really interesting. And also if we're thinking sort of Northern Europe, you're using a lot of wools, which I love to sew with. So that part would be really fun and rewarding. I would probably less be interested in sewing for Victorians, not because the clothing aren't beautiful, but because they involve more pieces and by the time you get to the Victorian era, fashion is changing faster. So you are not just like the Victorian era writ large, which was like 60 years, but what are you making in the 1870s versus what are you making in the 1880s makes a difference. And if you are a time traveling person trying to save the world, you don't want to look like your clothes are out of fashion because that's embarrassing. So
you didn't even consider future eras.
I have feelings because every time anyone tries to think about what the future is going to look like, it's generally ridiculous. So I don't think I even want to touch it. I just I'm not even going to touch it.
You don't want to sew like 40 million identical silver jumpsuits?
Well, so my hope would be that by the time we're sewing silver jumpsuits, and that's what we're wearing, the fabrics are going to be things that we don't actually have right now, that we'll have like fabrics that are made of materials that are maybe more sustainable than what we have, or maybe more durable than what we have, or like change with your body so your body can change and you can still wear the same clothes if you want, or like protect your body from, the no doubt terrible UV rays that we'll have because the ozone layer will have disappeared. So
I'm ready to sew in the cyberpunk future and just make nice cloths with like happy little nanobots. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, that sounds great. But if you are sewing now, you won't have those fabrics and your people will not be properly protected for the future. So
that's true. If you were like a time traveling seamstress, you'd have to like go on like your own on like these espionage recovery missions to go get future and past fabrics. Wow, the lore goes deep here.
This is a side note that you don't have to include, but there was an article recently about the seamstresses who worked with the SOE, the British Special Spy Force during World War II, who made the outfits for spies who would be sent to France. And literally, if you didn't get the right buttons, your spies could be found out because there were different buttons that were made in France than in England. Or if the shoes weren't lasted, if like the last of the shoe wasn't made the correct way, your spy could be found out and captured and killed. So like mega pressure on for those seamstresses.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So our other question this week was from @Vivadeer. Do you think there is a certain look to different identities, like a lesbian look or a butch look? Is there value in these stereotypes, or do you think they do more harm than good?
I think that there isn't one look, certainly, for what it means to be any identity. Obviously, you can be a lesbian and wear anything, and you don't have to ascribe to any particular look. What I do think is, I do think that there are maybe particular garments or particular ways of combining garments or particular ways of adding accessories that have historically coded meanings that might still be meaningful to us. So there might be things that we might want to put on our bodies because it allows us to kind of signal as queer when we're out in the world. And like, I can think of like the fun of like wearing like a pinky ring because it sort of signals back to like 40s butch culture, or like the fact that like every queer person I know does still have a couple of flannels in their wardrobe, even if they don't really wear them that often. I mean, I think that there are some things that maybe connect to sort of a historical sense of queerness or that are coded queer that are fun or affirming to pick up because it allows you to sort of like give a wink to other queers when you're out in the world. And that part I like, but you can wear whatever you want and be whatever identity you are. So.
Okay. I think now we get to move into my favorite section of the podcast, which is my question of the week. Every week I ask a pretty strange question, although I'm going to have trouble competing with that first one that was amazing. And we are all going to answer this. It is the year 5000. Your remains are found enshrined in a tomb of cloth. What pattern does it have on it? So, as the question asker, I'll go first, because I've had the most time to think about this. Mine would be a very, very encrypted, but obviously language. So that when future historians found it, they would spend decades decrypting and, putting together this, only to find that I had actually just put on a choice selection of drill quotes.
Incredible.
I love that.
Truly incredible. So my answer to this question is way less deep. My tomb of cloth would be made out of the like comfy warm fabric of like those Mario pajama pants. You know the ones I'm talking about. I want to be entombed in comfy Mario.
I like that. I think we should all be buried wearing our comfiest pajamas. That sounds great. I don't know what mine would be. I think mine would so the pattern, it would have to be something floral because I just wear all florals all the time. I love any floral pattern you can come up with. But literally, I'm going to say the nerdiest thing, which is your question was in 5,000 years in the future. And I was like, well, fabric doesn't last that long. It would already have disintegrated.
It's magic fabric.
It's magic fabric. I mean, depends on the conditions of the atmosphere. But yes, magic fabric covered in flowers. Very beautiful. Just swaths of flowers around me. That sounds great.
Sounds pretty great, yeah. I think that's everything we got for you. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions, for laughing at our bad jokes, and for telling us all about the ins and outs of queerly forward sewing. So Shannon, where can the good people who download this podcast find you?
So if you're on Instagram, you can find my personal account at rare.device, and you can find the So Queer account at So Queer. It's SEWQUEER. You can also find my blog at withararedevice.wordpress.com, where I post more detailed information about the things I make. That's particularly of interest if you're a person who's like, how the heck did this all come together?
Cool. I look forward to seeing more of your Instagram posts, honestly. They're real fun. So if you like this podcast, you can find us on iTunes, currently at settingtherecordqueer.com is a nice little human readable link. You can also find us on SoundCloud, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. If there's somewhere else you want to hear this podcast and it's not there, let us know. To get in contact with us, you can hit us up via email at settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com or on Twitter at STRQueercast. Get in contact with us if you have questions for us or our future guests. If you want to send feedback, if you have a cool idea for what or who an episode could be about, or if you think you'd even be a good fit for an episode of this podcast, let us know. And Kaylee mentioned earlier that we have a little announcement. We do. We have a new method with which you can get in contact with us. When this podcast releases, we will be publicly opening a Setting the Record Queer Discord community. So if you want to come hang out with your host and your other hosts and potentially a bunch of Setting the Record Queer listeners, we'll be taking questions and stuff from there as well. Hopefully we'll be able to get some of our guests to come hang out as well, but no promises there. They might be too cool for us. So look for a link to that in the show notes. And hopefully you'll come join and enjoy. Our podcast's logo art was made by Cubotic. That's at QBTIC on Twitter, and Cobot, QOBOT.tumblr.com. Our theme music was made by Thrill Me Music. You can find out more about their work at thrillmemusic.squarespace.com. This podcast was edited by Kaylee and produced by yours truly, Alexis. Kaylee, where can the good people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at WitchesHex, that's WITCHS Hex, or on Twitch with the same handle, except for with an underscore between Witches and Hex.
You can find me at ProtoMagicalGirl on Twitch or YouTube, or Twitch at proto.ml. Find me on Twitter and Instagram at Princess Proto, and if you want to come hang out in my personal Discord community of a bunch of queers who really like playing video games fast, you can do that at proto.ml/D. Our favorite answer to last week's Kaylee's question of the week, which was, if you were a retro computer, what features would you have, came from Krista Cuddles on Twitter, who said, I would have an RS-232 debug port with direct access to my CPU and memory. That's all for Setting the Record Queer, episode 3. Thank you for listening.